The first glimpse at any of the dungeons in Echoes of Wisdom occurs before we even take control of Zelda herself. During this prologue section, we briefly play as Link, though the amount of dungeon there is available to us, as well as the route you take through here, is both quite limited as well as heavily curated. We'll touch on the layout changes and how their paths deviate a little later in the video, but the point is that this makes sense as a tutorial section. We're taking control of Link at the end of his journey. It all feels so wonderfully familiar, and is a glimpse into the power we may be able to achieve again later on in the game. This little foray into Suthorn Ruins as Link is pretty brief, and there's not a lot of level design to analyze per se. There aren't any real forks in the road to navigate or puzzles to complete, but instead we're given some time to get acquainted with controlling our character in a relatively safe setting. Even though there are enemies known for being tough, like Darknuts, we're taking control of Link at such a powerful state that we're not really in harm's way at any time here. So while the navigation is simple, this is by design. A digestible, linear series of corridors and rooms containing little obstacles to get us familiar with the jumping controls, and a fair amount of enemies leading up towards the boss fight. An all too familiar boss fight against Ganon. Call it fan service, but I prefer to look at this as the game putting veteran fans squarely in our comfort zones before pulling the rug out from beneath us. Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda, an ongoing series examining all things dungeon related. With Link's Awakening's dungeons finished, we can dive into Echoes of Wisdom, which in many ways feels like a return to form after the way Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom deviated from the classic dungeon formula, but in just as many ways feels like a fresh, new interpretation of what a Zelda game can be. However, before we get into the first dungeon properly, there's a few pre-dungeon things to talk about. Let's hop right into things. Tutorials are something that always fascinates me. How does a game choose to teach the player its language and systems? The answer used to be a manual, but as time has gone on, game development has turned to more directly integrated forms of teaching. In the case of the Zelda series, this job fell on to the first dungeon. As the series has evolved, those tutorials gradually became more front-loaded, giving players more time before their first dungeon to learn how the game works. So the dungeon can be designed in such a way to apply those skills rather than teach them to you. Now, if you ask me which design philosophy I prefer, I really couldn't say at this point. I don't think either one is inherently better or worse, so long as the gameplay and that tutorial section are engaging to get through. It always comes down to execution. So what's interesting about all of this is that Echoes of Wisdom seems to straddle the line a bit. We had a Link tutorial section in the dungeon, albeit with a limited scope, and then we had all of that ripped away so that we could go through an additional tutorial outside of the dungeon as Zelda. And I think it's handled pretty well. It doesn't last long or overstay its welcome. Instead, it neatly sets up the story and sends you on your way. And I can say confidently, being on my third playthrough of the game now, that it succeeds in remaining engaging on repeated playthroughs. Say what you will about stealth sections, but I found enjoyment in trying to approach this scenario in different ways each time I ventured through here. Exploring the Suthorn Beach, village, and forest, meanwhile, is a more limited space, a microcosm of the overworld exploration, teaching you that if you poke look into nooks and crannies, you'll be rewarded, whether it be via cash, heart pieces, or useful echoes. At the end of the forest path is where we will find our portal into the still world, and by extension, our first dungeon. So, in the first hour or so, the game has taught us quite a lot, including how its overall structure will play out. Explore the world, talk to people for story stuff, find your way into the rifts, use the echoes you obtained in Hyrule to platform through the still world, and then tackle the dungeon. So, with all of that said, let's get to talking about the dungeon itself. Once we've made our way through the stilled southern forest, we can head into the dungeon. Welcome back to Suthorn Ruins, the first dungeon in Echoes of Wisdom. Suthorn Ruins is a simple dungeon. I doubt there will be anything here that stumps you or keeps you puzzling over what to do next. And while many people would take that as a statement of criticism, that is, in fact, the dungeon design working as intended. This is a tutorial dungeon. It's the first proper dungeon in the game. Starter dungeons should be simple, so long as they are not boring, which I don't think this is. It's all about laying the groundwork. But first, let's have a look at the architecture. It looks pretty good. The whole place just reeks of lost ancient ruins with stone bricks and signs of deterioration that go back farther than the recent collapse of the structure that we witnessed during the game's prologue. My only real critique might be that because it leans so heavily into that idea, it comes across as a little generic and without a strong visual identity of its own like later dungeons will have. As though if it were removed from its context within the game, it could be slotted in pretty much anywhere in Hyrule. It's the epitome of generic Zelda dungeon. However, I do think that was intentional to an extent, and we'll circle back to why that is in a little bit. Despite that lack of strong visual theming, Suthorn does have some nice memorable set pieces and visual landmarks that do help it stand out, such as the massive elevator, these moving platforms, and this long, dramatic staircase. So it's not without some cool moments. Moments that are there to tie our second venture into the dungeon with our initial trek through as Link. If the player hadn't yet connected the dots of this being the same place for some reason, then that elevator is going to be the thing that reaffirms that for them. Though when we come back as Zelda, we don't get to visit this hallway, which had some really nice lighting effects with the windows here, alas. There's also some cool little eye motifs on the walls all over the place, though strangely, rather than pupils, we see these little dots and dashes, almost like Morse code symbols, though they don't seem to actually translate to anything as far as I could tell. A different interpretation is that rather than eye shapes, these could be a repeating double helix pattern, which is naturally harder to depict on a flat surface, but that might fit better than eyes given that sometimes the orientation is vertical rather than horizontal. And the double helix pattern does somewhat call to mind the way the tri-rod splits and twists around itself in a way, but maybe I've just spent too long looking at these walls. Speaking of which, there's also this carving along various pillars, which too looks like it could be a depiction of the tri-rod or something similar. Between that and the various little dashes and dots, Suthorn Ruins could have been a temple with ties to the tries themselves. I mean, have a look at these stone tablets and the faces of Tri's friends. Maybe I'm reaching, but it wouldn't surprise me if there were some connection, the knowledge of which may have been lost to time, especially since this is the temple Tri was originally imprisoned in during the game's prologue. The dungeon music, like the architecture, errs a bit on the generic side. it's a little forgettable compared to some of the offerings of the rest of the game's soundtrack, but it's far from a bad dungeon theme, and listening to it on repeat while writing this script has actually made me appreciate it more. It fails to be the kind of dungeon theme that I'll be humming to myself, but it still does the job and fits the atmosphere pretty well to a T. The song strikes that delicate balance of mysterious and dangerous, which is very dungeon-esque, as these places tend to contain a healthy mix of combat and puzzles. Overall, the song is unintrusive, but at times feels thoughtful in a way. It may not be very catchy, but I'm also of the belief that not every dungeon theme has to be. I mean, the majority of both Wind Waker and Twilight Princess's dungeon themes are mostly atmospheric or ambient, so it may not be fantastic, but it does its job well enough. As for the navigation, things are pretty much as simple as you'd expect for a first dungeon. As I stated earlier, the game is establishing its difficulty curve pretty gracefully so far. Progression is straightforward, but rewards players who choose to deviate from the main path with treasure chests and rewards, teaching and reinforcing to us that exploration is worthwhile. Then that idea gets further reinforced a little later on, as these splits in the path get promoted from optional detours to critical parts of the dungeon progression, by way of incorporating locked doors and keys to find. These forks in the road often have one locked door and a key to find via the other path, though sometimes there are even additional deviations in these key paths. This is all done on a relatively small scale, but again, this is simply the starter dungeon. Something that I find to be pretty neat is the way the game uses in-universe means to differentiate our two journeys through the ruins. The path we take here originally as Link mostly keeps us sticking to these eastern and central hallways, as these deviations are blocked off by rubble, with Link's journey ultimately coming to a close in this arena where we battle Ganon. When we return as Zelda, many of the rooms we went through as Link are likewise inaccessible due to fallen debris, and there are even rooms sliced away entirely by the rifts, though in turn new paths have been exposed that Zelda can now take. So the overlap between rooms that these two end up exploring is pretty minimal in the end. Furthermore, the room that serves as Link's boss room ends up only being the mid-boss room when Zelda shows up, with a whole extra chunk of dungeon for her to continue on through afterwards. So in the end, while the more memorable moments will drive home that association, Zelda takes a distinctly different route through the dungeon than Link did, which, from a design standpoint, was the right call, as it keeps things from getting too repetitive. Rather than finding a traditional dungeon item in here, the game has a handful of stand-ins that essentially work the same way. Your first thought is probably the echoes that are available to learn here, and you wouldn't be wrong there. Strantulas act almost like a stand-in for using a hookshot or grappling hook to gain height or cross gaps, though some of the most useful echoes, such as the Peahat or the Ignizol, were found just before the dungeon, but there are workarounds if you missed those. That said, what feels to me like the big item stand-ins for this dungeon specifically are Bind and Sword Fighter form. Let's begin with the former. We gain access to Bind quite early on in the dungeon, and it has great utility all throughout. Initially, we're taught to use it to move this boulder so that we can access a switch and open a door. Then that gets a bit of a shakeup where a boulder is blocking a hidden passage, but we can also move it into position to use as a platform and cross this gap. Then we can use it to pluck this treasure chest out of the ground. I think the implied method is also to move this rock out of the way with it, but I'm sure there are other equally valid ways around it. From here on, the dungeon continues iterating on the uses for bind. There's a shield on this statue that acts as a mechanism for opening this door when you pull it, but is also a hint towards how you can use bind to yank shields out of enemy hands, including this dungeon's mid-boss. And since the dungeon keeps putting bindable things behind bars, you will probably also pick up on the fact that you can use bind on these Deku Babas to just pull their heads right off. My favorite though is this series of iterated upon puzzles, in which we use bind to manipulate statues and press down switches. These are particularly great and are used for lowering gates and then ultimately getting the boss key. I know a lot of people were quick to compare bind to Tears of the Kingdom's Ultra Hand, and while I can understand why, I mean just look at it, I feel it's a bit of a shallow comparison. Ultra Hand had very few limitations. You could freely move an object and yourself around, including rotating, manipulating, and attaching things. That's not the case with bind. Instead, it mechanically more closely resembles the Dominion Rod from Twilight Princess. Once you have bound to an object, you can only move it in tandem with your own movements, allowing the developers to craft puzzles which incorporate this ability into the room layouts. You can't just pick up a statue and place it onto the Switch. You have to move in such a way to make that feasible, even if it means building your own staircase ahead of time to pull it off. I like this mechanic a lot, and this dungeon's puzzles showcase its potential really nicely. There's also reverse bond, which flips it so that you are being moved by the bound target instead, which gets put to use in this dungeon with these moving platforms. But the versatility of reverse bond will only grow as your arsenal of echoes expands. The other item stand-in is Sword Fighter form, which we get after a mid-boss against an echo of Link. Sword Fighter form essentially lets you transform into Link for a short period of time, as indicated by this gauge, which will gradually deplete while you're using it. I have mixed feelings about its inclusion, if I'm being honest. There are times when the game really feels like it pushes for you to use it, especially during boss fights, but its usefulness constantly swings between being really overpowered and being superannuated by other abilities as the game goes on. It is a mixed bag, but it also is the key to a simple item gate, those being these dark web-like barriers that block various doorways through the dungeon. So from that standpoint, it is a key item that is critical to dungeon progression, as well as being a very useful tool for combat, albeit one with some limitations. Let's talk about that mid-boss too. Fighting Link here is a rare treat, and I feel they did him justice in this encounter. He will shred through pretty well any enemy echo that you summon. That little taste of being overpowered in the game's prologue, that was both to teach you the mechanics of Sword Fighter form, as well as being foreshadowing for this fight. He is relentless, so you've really got to strategize to take him down. But with all of the tools at your disposal, it is more than doable, especially if you picked up on that hint from the statue earlier about using bind to rip away his shield. All in all, it's a great mid-boss fight. So with all of that said and done, once we've made our way through here, collected these keys and completed these puzzles, we can use the big key to open this rather imposing door and confront the dungeon boss. Rising from the ground is the Seismic Talus, our first dungeon boss, and he looks great. Aesthetically, of course, he's a big rock golem with a glowing weak point orb, which will get shuffled around his body over the course of the battle. A real Thardus situation for my fellow Metroid fans, but its rocky appearance paired with the glowing purple is a great look for this boss, perfectly straddling that line of being imposing, but also fitting with the game's art direction. What's interesting to me is that Talus's are very Wilds era in terms of bosses, but I think they translated what was an open world boss into a traditional dungeon boss very well. Bind, being our stand-in for a dungeon item, gets put to particularly good use here. You don't have to use it to fight him, but it will make the fight much easier. You can use Bind to yank his weak point right out of him, which naturally will stun him and leave him vulnerable to attack, either through use of echoes or sword fighter form. That said, there's just enough versatility in this fight for you to approach it differently and still come out victorious, so long as you put in the work. He's got some pretty good sweeping attacks, which he telegraphs well, giving the fight an overall good push and pull sort of flow, pun intended, as you need to avoid getting caught up in his large swipes and punches in order to pull off the bind strategy with effective timing. As the fight goes on, his weak point will keep moving to higher up on his body as well, eventually going from his bottom to literally the top of his head, effectively narrowing the window of timing for you to use either bind or directly attack his weak point. In other words, the fight has its very own built-in difficulty curve, getting just a touch more challenging the further through the fight you get, which is rarely seen in a boss fight without them just outright having additional phases that either alter their behavior or expand their repertoire of attacks. This is a simple adjustment that does the same trick, and while the fight never gets to be too hard, we're still in the first dungeon, I can't help but admire how clever that little touch of design is. So, in the end, the Seismic Talus may at first glance be a rather unremarkable boss, but in actuality ends up being quite well designed, fulfilling its role as first boss gracefully. So overall, Suthorn Ruins is a solid starter dungeon. It introduces the player to key new mechanics, then iterates upon them. It has exciting set pieces that fit into and progress the story, and teaches us through its own layout how dungeon progression will go. I cannot describe how palpable my excitement was when I saw a locked door, okay? A few more notes I have though, so I'm sure that if you watched my coverage of Link's Awakening's dungeons, then you may have anticipated this talking point being included. But I don't think my conclusion on the subject will be as predictable. For context, when talking about that game, I stated multiple times that I was not a huge fan of these side-scrolling passageways, as I felt they were a cheap band-aid solution to bridge disconnected rooms. I felt it was a byproduct of the game so rigidly trying to maintain their dungeon's map layouts, as most of them were shaped after various objects. Bottle Grotto after empty bottles, Key Cavern is shaped like a key, you get the idea. In the remake, this issue was alleviated by the ability to leave pins on the map, so that you could see at a glance how the various rooms connect to each other. So I was a little nervous going into it with Echoes of Wisdom, knowing full well that these side-scrolling passageways would be returning, but I am happy to say that I don't feel the same way about it here. Rather than feeling like they've boxed themselves into a layout and needed an easy way to connect rooms without actually just connecting them, these sections in Echoes of Wisdom feel like they were intentionally included as parts of the level design from the start. The dungeons aren't really locked into shapes, and these passageways are fully displayed on the map with with connecting lines to show you how they integrate with the rest of the dungeon, and they're all greatly expanded upon. In Link's Awakening, they tended to be essentially short hallways, with the odd obstacle thrown in. Here, they can span multiple screens and usually have their own puzzles and mechanics built in. All in all, the concept just feels better fleshed out here, like they've more fully realized the potential of this. So rather than just needing to connect some rooms, they've made it a proper part of the dungeon. One that is, again, visible on the map by default. Thank you. Speaking of the dungeon map, we get those, although no compass. Still, I like its inclusion, as silly as that may sound. Tears of the Kingdom, for whatever reason, removed the need to obtain the map at all, giving it to you automatically as soon as you stepped into a dungeon. Even Breath of the Wild had you needing to download it from a terminal at least. While I don't feel quite as negatively about Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons as many people do, in fact, I even like most of them, I still felt like the absence of that requirement was a bit odd. But it's back in Echoes of Wisdom, and I'm here for that, because it means you have to actually explore to find it, which is a rewarding part of the overall dungeon experience for me, though they've done away with the compass and combined it with the map like Skyward Sword did, which is too bad because I like finding the compass too. Maybe it's because Link's Awakening made the compass just a little extra useful, but alas. That said, I do have a little bit of a gripe with how the map screen itself is handled. This is more of a UI complaint than one with the dungeon design itself, but still, hear me out. I just find the field of view on the map screen to be a little too tight. I like being able to zoom in on the map, but I'd also like to be able to zoom out more. I prefer being able to open the map and see the entire dungeon at a glance, or at least the entirety of the floor that I'm on. It gives me a better feel for the space and the overall bigger picture. Instead, we get this scrolling thing, and the passageways, while connected on the map, are separately placed on the bottom of the map screen. So while it's better than in Link's Awakening, they still feel a little more removed than I'd like. So this is a mock-up of how I would display it for readability's sake, but that's just me. All of that said, as I was playing through this dungeon and taking notes, one word kept jumping out to me. That word was generic. The dungeon feels generic. Its appearance, its music, enemies, even the branching path system of its layout. There's plenty of cleverness in there, and it is extremely effective at teaching the game to the player, but it otherwise felt weirdly lacking its own identity in a way that this game's other dungeons don't. But as I kept seeing that word pop up in my notes, and then seeing the way various elements of this dungeon bear aesthetic resemblances to Wild Era elements, while having mechanical similarities to classic Zelda elements, it all started to make sense in my head. So here's my theory about why this dungeon was made the way that it was. I believe this dungeon was designed to introduce classic dungeons to a new audience. While many of us series veterans might write this off as being too simple of a dungeon for our tastes, any Zelda game could be someone's entry point into the series, and that's a good thing. And so the game needs to have an establishing dungeon to make sure new players can learn the core systems and design ideas, especially after the huge influx of new fans that were brought in by the Wild Era games, who may have never laid eyes upon a boss key before. I know. In other words, I think this dungeon was specifically made to teach players who became Zelda fans from Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom how classic Zelda dungeons work before the rest of the game runs with it and experiments. They give you an ability that looks familiar. It looks just like Ultra Hand, but it doesn't work that way. It works like the Dominion Rod. They give you the ability to construct your own platforms and bridges. You might think, hey, that's just like Tears of the Kingdom, but now you're in tight spaces and side-scrolling sections with severe limitations. They give you a boss literally right from Breath of the Wild, but you don't fight it that way. It's been redesigned to fit the parameters of this game. How clever is that? I don't say this to drive a wedge in the fandom. I am not trying to divide long-time and new fans. Quite the opposite. I think this game and this dungeon are really doing the opposite, uniting them. Old meet new. Thank you so much for watching. Special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon. So thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight Naomi, Bunny, Stefan, Avery and their ATHDs, as well as all of the folks whose names you're seeing on screen right now. You guys are awesome. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.